It was supposed to be a quiet day, but everything changed when Karen from the HOA decided to target me. I had just bought my new electric car a few weeks ago, and it was the pride of my driveway. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of my hard work and freedom. Little did I know, my neighbor, Karen, and the HOA had other plans. It started off as a normal morning, but within hours, I'd find myself dealing with a full-on HOA nightmare. What started as a simple misunderstanding quickly turned into a fight for my rights. Little did Karen know, she was about to meet someone who wasn't going to back down. It all began when I parked my new electric car in my driveway one evening. It was sleek, modern, and shiny, exactly what I had dreamed of. I had a small garage, but it wasn't big enough to fit my car, so I parked it in the driveway. I knew it was safe there. It wasn't blocking anyone's path, and there was plenty of room on my property for the car. Or at least, that's what I thought. That night, I had no idea that this small decision would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The next morning, I went out to grab some coffee, and as I was walking towards my car, I noticed something strange. Karen, who lived 2 houses down, was standing right in front of my driveway, staring at my car. She didn't see me at first, so I watched her for a moment. She was looking at the car with a strange, judgmental look. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I quickly brushed it off, assuming she was just passing by. However, as I walked closer, I realized she wasn't passing by, she was looking at my car like it was something she had a problem with. I greeted her with a simple, "Hey, how's it going?" but she just stared at me, not saying a word. Her eyes were cold, and I could feel a tension building up in the air. I asked her if everything was okay, and that's when she finally spoke. "You can't park that car here," she said, pointing at the sleek electric car in my driveway. I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "It's my driveway, my property." But Karen wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and told me that I needed to move my car. She claimed it violated some HOA rule about how cars should be parked on the property. I couldn't believe it. I had read through the HOA rules when I moved in, and there was nothing about how I should park my car. I asked her to show me the rule, but she just shrugged and said I would get a formal complaint soon. She warned me, in her usual Karen-like tone, that the HOA wouldn't stand for this. I didn't know how to respond, but I stood my ground. "It's my property, Karen. I'll park where I want. This car is my responsibility, and if I want to park it here, I will." That should have been the end of it. But Karen, as I soon found out, wasn't the type to let things go. She stormed off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time I heard from her. I went inside, shaking my head, not sure what to make of the situation. I figured she'd move on, but in the back of my mind, I had this nagging feeling that I had just made a dangerous enemy. The feeling only grew stronger when, a few days later, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. The letter from the HOA was exactly what I feared. Karen had followed through on her threat. The HOA was claiming that my car was violating some supposed parking regulation. They had apparently taken her word as gospel, without any real investigation. The letter said that I needed to either move my car or face a fine, and I was given a deadline to comply. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The whole thing felt like an overreaction, especially since my car wasn't causing any issues. It was parked in front of my house, and no one had complained before. I was furious. I had already dealt with enough HOA drama in the past, and now it felt like they were making up rules as they went along. The letter mentioned that Karen had already spoken to other board members, and they were on her side. I knew this was just a personal vendetta at that point. I had done nothing wrong, yet Karen was using her position in the HOA to try and force me into complying with something that made no sense. The more I read the letter, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about parking a car anymore, this was about power, control, and someone thinking they could dictate how I lived my life. I decided right then and there that I wasn't going to back down. The HOA had no right to tell me where I could park my car on my property. But I wasn't going to just ignore the letter either. I knew Karen and the HOA wouldn't stop at just one letter, they'd keep pushing until they got what they wanted. So, I made the decision to fight back. I immediately started gathering all the documents I needed to prove my case. I got a copy of the property deed, which clearly showed that my driveway was mine and that there were no restrictions on parking. I also looked up the HOA's rules again, this time with a fine-tooth comb, and found nothing about parking restrictions that applied to me. I was ready to show them that I wasn't going to be pushed around. A few days later, I showed up at the next HOA meeting with all my evidence in hand. I knew I was about to face Karen again, but this time, I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. The meeting room was filled with people, and I could see Karen sitting at the head of the table, looking smug as usual. As soon as I walked in, she shot me a look that could freeze water, but I wasn't fazed. The board president opened the meeting and went straight to the issue at hand. Karen immediately jumped in, saying that my car was an eyesore and that it was against HOA regulations. I felt the anger rising in me again, but I took a deep breath and calmly explained my side of the story. I presented my evidence, showing them that my car was parked within my rights and that there was no rule that I had violated. For a while, Karen tried to argue, throwing out half-baked accusations about how my car was causing problems in the neighborhood. But the more I spoke, the more the other board members started to question her. They asked her to provide proof of the rule she was claiming, but she couldn't. It became clear that her only evidence was her own opinion, and that wasn't going to hold up. The president finally spoke up, admitting that Karen's complaint didn't have any real grounds. I could see the relief on some of the other board members' faces as they realized they'd been led into a situation with no legal backing. After a tense silence, the president turned to me and said that they wouldn't pursue the issue any further. I couldn't believe it. After all the stress, all the back and forth, I had won. My rights were respected, and Karen was forced to back down. But Karen didn't take it well. As the meeting ended, she stormed out, muttering under her breath about how I would regret this. I didn't care. I knew she would try something else eventually, but for now, I had won this battle. A few weeks passed, and life started to feel normal again. My car was still parked in my driveway, where it belonged, and Karen seemed to have disappeared from my life, at least for the time being. I thought that the HOA situation was over and done with. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to let go of a grudge so easily. It wasn't long before I received a strange phone call one afternoon. It was from a lawyer, and immediately I knew this wasn't good. The lawyer told me that Karen had hired him to pursue legal action against me. She was claiming that I had caused damage to the neighborhood and that my car was a public nuisance. Apparently, she had gone behind my back again, rallying other HOA members to her cause. This time, she was demanding that I remove my car or face a lawsuit. I couldn't believe it. After the board had already sided with me, I thought I was free from this nonsense. But here we were again, with Karen trying to drag me into a legal battle. The lawyer was polite, but his words were firm. He told me that if I didn't comply, Karen would sue for public disruption and other vague charges. He didn't seem too convincing, though. As soon as I hung up, I felt more confident than ever that Karen had no case. I had already been through this fight, and I wasn't about to let her win. I wasn't going to be intimidated by her or her threats. I quickly reached out to my own lawyer and explained the situation. My lawyer reassured me that Karen's claims were baseless. There was no way she could win, and any lawsuit would be thrown out as frivolous. I wasn't going to let Karen get away with trying to control my life. I immediately filed a counterclaim, not just to defend my rights but also to send a message to Karen that I wouldn't tolerate her harassment any longer. I knew this could drag out, but I was ready for the fight. I also started talking to some of my neighbors, just to see if anyone else had dealt with Karen and her antics. Some of them were actually supportive, offering to testify if things went to court. Others were too scared to get involved, but it was clear that Karen wasn't exactly popular in the neighborhood. The legal battle was draining, but I wasn't backing down. After weeks of exchanging letters and phone calls, the situation finally reached a breaking point. One day, I received a letter from Karen's lawyer stating that they were dropping the case. The letter was vague, but it was clear that Karen had realized she wasn't going to get what she wanted. I couldn't believe it. After everything she had put me through, she was finally giving up. But the drama didn't stop there. Just when I thought it was over, something completely unexpected happened. I got a call from a local news station that had heard about the whole situation. They wanted to do a story about Karen's overreach, the HOA's mishandling of the situation, and how I had fought back against their baseless claims. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to get involved, but after thinking about it, I realized this could be a great opportunity to expose Karen for who she really was. I agreed to the interview. The news segment aired a few days later, and it was everything I had hoped for. The story went viral, and the community quickly rallied around me. People from all over town sent messages of support, and some even reached out to share their own HOA horror stories. It was amazing to see how many people had been affected by the same kind of behavior. The more people shared their stories, the more Karen's actions looked like the petty, vindictive behavior of someone who thought they could control everyone around them. In the end, Karen's reputation took a huge hit. I knew she'd try to save face, but the damage was already done. After the story aired, she couldn't even look me in the eye when we passed each other on the street. The HOA also came under scrutiny, and there were rumors that they might start investigating Karen's actions as a board member. I never expected things to go this far, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It felt like a big win, not just for me but for everyone who had been pushed around by overbearing HOA members in the past. After the media storm died down, things went back to normal. Karen never bothered me again, and the HOA seemed to keep its distance. My car stayed in the driveway, and I finally felt like I could breathe easy again. I had stood my ground, and in the end, I came out victorious. But I knew one thing for sure: if Karen ever tried anything again, I would be ready. She had learned the hard way that I wasn't someone to be messed with. Months went by without any sign of Karen or the HOA. The tension that had built up over those past weeks seemed to have disappeared, and I finally felt like I could truly enjoy the peace I had worked so hard to maintain. But as anyone who's dealt with an HOA or a neighbor like Karen knows, peace can sometimes be fleeting. One day, I was sitting in my living room, sipping my coffee and scrolling through some emails, when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I got up to answer it. When I opened the door, there she was, Karen. My stomach sank. I could see the same entitled expression on her face that I had seen so many times before. But this time, there was something different about her. She looked defeated. Before I could say anything, Karen spoke. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice softer than usual, "about everything that happened, and, well, I just wanted to apologize." I was shocked. I had braced myself for more of the same attitude, more threats, more complaints, but this was completely unexpected. Karen, the woman who had been so determined to make my life miserable, was now standing there, admitting she was wrong. It was almost surreal. She continued, "I know I went too far, and I see now that I had no right to interfere in your life like that. The whole situation got out of hand, and I should have just left you alone. I was wrong." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh, to feel victorious, but another part of me couldn't help but wonder what had caused this sudden change in her. Had the media coverage really made that big of an impact? Or was she just trying to save face after everything had backfired? Either way, I wasn't ready to forgive her just yet. "You really put me through a lot, Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady. You made my life miserable for weeks, and for what? A car in my own driveway? She nodded, looking genuinely remorseful. I know, and I regret it. I guess I just let my position on the board get to my head. I thought I could control everything, but I was wrong. I've learned a lot through all of this. I stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to tell her off, to let her know how much she had hurt me, but another part of me just wanted to move on. I wasn't going to let her dictate my actions anymore, but maybe it was time to put this all behind me. After a long silence, I finally spoke. Look, Karen, I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change everything that happened. You can't just undo all the stress you caused. But I'm willing to let it go. For now. Karen looked relieved, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Thank you, she said quietly. I really appreciate that. And I promise, I won't bother you again. I just wanted to make things right. With that, she turned and walked away. As I closed the door, I felt a mix of emotions. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear, the situation was over. Karen had learned her lesson, and I had one. The HOA was no longer a problem, and my car remained right where it belonged. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the HOA. Surprisingly, it was an apology for the whole ordeal. They acknowledged that the complaint had been unfounded and promised to review their policies moving forward. It felt like a victory, but in a way, it also felt like closure. The HOA had backed down, Karen had apologized, and life had returned to normal. It wasn't easy, but I had learned a lot from the whole experience. It taught me to stand up for myself, even when the odds seemed stacked against me. And while I would never wish for another confrontation with Karen or anyone like her, I felt stronger knowing that I had stood my ground. For now, I was finally at peace. My car, my property, and my rights were safe, and that was all that mattered. As time went on, things seemed to settle into a new routine. I didn't hear much from Karen or the HOA after that final encounter. The neighborhood felt calmer, quieter, and more like the peaceful place I had originally imagined when I moved in. There were no more surprises or confrontations, and for the first time in months, I was able to just enjoy life without constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next battle would begin. However, even in the calmest of neighborhoods, things can change in the blink of an eye. A few months after the situation with Karen had ended, I began to notice something odd. I'd occasionally see cars that looked suspiciously like they belonged to HOA members, driving slowly past my house. It wasn't something I dwelled on, but it felt like they were keeping an eye on me. It made me uneasy at first, but I brushed it off as nothing more than paranoia. After all, Karen had backed down, and the HOA had promised not to interfere. Then, one day, as I was cleaning up my yard, I noticed a couple of unfamiliar figures walking up my driveway. At first, I thought it was a delivery or some sort of neighborly visit, but as they got closer, I recognized one of them. It was a board member from the HOA, someone I had never had a direct run-in with, but had seen at meetings. The other figure was a man I didn't recognize, but he was holding a clipboard, and they both looked very official. Before I could say anything, the HOA board member spoke. "We're conducting a routine inspection of properties in the area," he said in a tone that was far too businesslike for something that seemed so out of the blue. "Just checking compliance with some of the community rules." I was immediately on edge. A routine inspection? It was a phrase I had never heard them use before, and it sounded suspiciously like they were trying to find a reason to get involved in my property again. "I'm afraid that's not necessary," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "There's no issue here. I've already been through this with you." The man with the clipboard stepped forward and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "We're just doing our job. We'll be quick. Don't mind us." He seemed insistent, and I could tell by the way he was looking at my property that he was eyeing every little detail. I knew what they were doing, trying to find a reason to bring up old complaints. I wasn't going to let them. Actually, I think we're done here, I said firmly. I don't need an inspection, and you're trespassing. I've made it clear to the HOA before that I won't tolerate anyone on my property without permission. The board member seemed caught off guard by my refusal. He hesitated for a moment before muttering something under his breath. "We'll be in touch," he said, then turned and walked away, leaving the clipboard guy trailing behind him. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. I couldn't believe it. The HOA was still trying to get under my skin, still trying to interfere with my life. I wasn't going to let them win again. I immediately called my lawyer and explained the situation. They assured me that they couldn't just show up like that without proper notice or a legitimate reason. I wasn't about to let them take another inch of my peace. A few days later, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, they claimed they needed to conduct a community audit of all properties, checking for compliance with the HOA rules. They were still acting like I had something to hide. It was clear that they were looking for any excuse to cause trouble. But I was ready. I had already been through the legal process with them once, and I wasn't about to back down. I decided to take a stand, not just for myself but for all the other homeowners who might be dealing with similar bullying tactics from the HOA. I reached out to some of my neighbors who had been affected by the HOA's overreach in the past. To my surprise, many of them were eager to stand with me. We weren't going to let the HOA intimidate us any longer. I organized a meeting with my lawyer and some of the other homeowners, and we decided to take action. We would formally request that the HOA provide proof of the necessity for these audits and inspections, as well as any legal justification for their continued interference in our lives. We weren't going to let them harass us anymore. A few weeks later, I went to another HOA meeting, this time with a group of neighbors who supported my cause. We all sat in the room, calm but determined, ready to confront the board members about their actions. Karen wasn't there, but we all knew she was still pulling the strings behind the scenes. This time, I wasn't alone. And I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. The meeting was tense, but by the end of it, we had made our voices heard. The board reluctantly agreed to halt their inspections, and acknowledged that they needed to review their practices to avoid overstepping their boundaries. It felt like a victory, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. We had finally put our foot down, and the HOA had learned that they couldn't get away with bullying homeowners anymore. It was another long road, but this time, I knew we had won. We had stood up together, and we had sent a strong message: no one was going to dictate how we lived on our own property. As for Karen, well, she had lost. And I had won, not just the battle over my car, but over my peace of mind. The neighborhood was finally free from her reign, and I could finally rest easy, knowing that I had the support of those who mattered, and the strength to protect my home.